Our first book for the reading session is Einstein Anderson, Science Sleuth, written by Seymour Simon. Blurb on the back. Yes, remember we were painting today. How does Einstein Anderson solve the mystery of the frictionless roller skates and many other science puzzles? Pit your wits against the junior mastermind and beat him at his own game. And the illustrations are by John Millington. Here we go. We got this book at Trash and Treasure. Okay, we've got 9 chapters. First one will be the frictionless roller skates. Chapter 1. It was the best day of the year. At least that's what Einstein Anderson thought. School had broken up yesterday in the town of Sparta. Today was the start of summer holidays. 2 months of sleeping late in the morning. 2 months of doing what Einstein wanted to do, not what Miss Sugar, his junior school teacher last term, wanted him to do. Einstein's real name was Adam, but nobody called him Adam except his father and mother once in a while. Einstein had been interested in science for as long as he could remember. From an early age, he'd solved science problem after science problem that had stumped even his teachers. At the age of 6, Einstein had explained to Miss Moore, his infants teacher, how to use the chemical cobalt chloride to test for humidity in the air. At the age of 7, Einstein had shown Mrs. Patrick, his next teacher, how to set up a balanced aquarium in the classroom. At the age of 8, Einstein had built a model of a robot that won first prize at a national science exhibition. It was Miss Moore who gave Adam the nickname of Einstein. Soon all his friends called him Einstein. Adam was proud of his nickname. He knew that Albert Einstein was the most famous scientist of the 20th century. He'd discovered many important things about the universe. Even his equation, E equals mc squared, led to the understanding of atomic energy. Albert Einstein had been a gentle, kind man as well as a genius. Einstein Anderson pushed his head deeper into his pillow. He thought he might get up in an hour or so. That is, if he felt like getting up. The phone downstairs began to ring. Einstein wished drowsily that someone would answer it. The ringing was keeping him awake. He opened one eye. Judging from the light in the room, he guessed it was 7 o'clock. Where was Mum? Where was Dad? Where was his younger brother Dennis? Did they expect Einstein to get up and answer the phone on the first day of his holiday? The phone stopped ringing. After a minute, Dennis yelled that the call was for Einstein. "Who is it?" Einstein called downstairs. "It's Stanley," Dennis answered. Stanley Rogers was a teenage friend of Einstein who was also very much into science. Einstein put on his glasses, walked down the stairs and picked up the phone sleepily. "This had better be an emergency, Stanley," Einstein exclaimed by way of greeting. "You know it's only 7 o'clock in the morning and this is the first day of the holidays?" Stanley paid no attention to his grumpiness. "Einstein," Stanley said, "meet me in the front of my house in half an hour. I have something to show you." That really upset Einstein. "First of all," he said, "I don't want to go out so early. Secondly, if you have something to show me, why don't you bring it over here?" As usual, Stanley ignored him. "See you in half an hour," he repeated, and hung up before Einstein could say anything. It must be another one of Stanley's crazy inventions, Einstein thought. But as long as I'm up, I suppose I might as well see what he's made this time. Einstein remembered Stanley's last invention, an automatic fitting machine. If you got into the machine, a computer was supposed to automatically measure everything from shoe size to belt and hat size. Stanley had persuaded Einstein to be the first person to go into the machine. The machine worked fine. The only trouble was that Stanley had not been able to shut it off after Einstein had been measured. Einstein had been trapped for an hour while the machine kept measuring him over and over again. Einstein liked Stanley, but didn't exactly trust Stanley's crazy inventions. Einstein washed and got dressed in his jeans, t-shirt and trainers. The jeans were all ragged at the knees, but they were Einstein's favourite. So far he'd refused to put them out for jumble, despite his mother's pointed suggestions. Einstein was an average-sized 12-year-old boy. His light brown eyes were a little nearsighted and his glasses seemed a bit too big for his face. His eyes sometimes had a faraway look, as if he were thinking about some important problem in science. But Einstein was not always serious. He loved a good joke, or even a bad one, and liked to make puns. The worse, the better. Dr. Anderson, Einstein's father, looked surprised when Einstein came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. He was just finishing breakfast and was about to leave for the office. Dr. Anderson was a veterinary surgeon. He was often up and about before Einstein came down to breakfast. To what do we owe the honour of your presence so early in the morning, Adam?" asked Dr. Anderson with a smile. "I'm going over to see Stanley," said Einstein. "He asked me to go over this morning." Einstein sniffed. "Any pancakes left, Mum?" he asked hopefully. "Oh, I just have time for a light breakfast." Einstein went to the refrigerator and poured himself a glass full of orange juice. Then he popped 2 slices of bread into the toaster. Finally, he poured himself a bowl of breakfast cereal and milk and sat down to eat. Mrs. Anderson looked on with amusement as she made another batch of pancakes. "I'm glad you're going to eat something," she said. "Too bad you haven't time for a proper breakfast." Mrs. Anderson jotted down a note on a pad while the pancakes sizzled. She worked as a writer and editor on the Sparta Tribune, one of the town's 2 newspapers. She often used the things the 2 boys did and said in humorous stories she wrote for the paper. Einstein finished his light breakfast and went over to Stanley's house. Einstein and Stanley lived in a part of Sparta that had a mixture of private homes and low-rise flats. But there was still a lot of undeveloped land around, with plenty of trees and woods and open fields. Just out Sparta, much of the land was used for farming, and with a few office buildings scattered here and there. Most of the shops and office buildings were in the city centre. It was a beautiful day. The early morning traffic had gone, and not many cars passed by. The sound of a power-driven lawnmower in the distance mingled with the sound of insects. The smell of newly cut hay grass hung in the air. On the way to Stanley's house, Einstein looked at some redwood ants, Formica rufa, going out into a anthill. He watched a downy woodpecker tapping for insects along a branch of a sugar maple tree. He also threw some small pebbles into the pond to test the strength of his arm, and decided that the cumulus clouds in the blue sky meant good weather. Einstein got to Stanley's house 25 minutes late. Stanley was putting on a pair of roller skates when Einstein arrived. Stanley looked pointedly at his watch. Einstein paid no attention and waited for Stanley to say something. Stanley was tall and thin. His long black hair was often falling over his eyes. "Despite the fact that you're so late, Einstein, I'm going to show you my new invention." "Oh, good," Einstein said. "I hope it's something that prevents people from waking up other people when they want to sleep late." Stanley didn't notice Einstein's tone of voice. He stood up and started to roller skate in the street. "Look at these skates," he said proudly. Einstein looked. "So?" he said. "It's a pair of skates. I think J.L. Plimpton invented roller skates in 1863. You're more than 100 years too late." "He didn't invent skates like these," said Stanley in that slightly superior way of his. "These skates are frictionless, you know," he said as he skated back towards Einstein. "You know that friction is a force that resists an object moving over the surface of another object." Einstein nodded impatiently. "Of course," he said. But Stanley continued with his explanation. "Suppose two things are touching. When they move, they rub each other. The rubbing causes the movement to slow down. We scientists call that friction. The smoother an object is, the less the friction it causes. I used a special method to make the ball bearings in the skate wheel smooth. There is absolutely no friction when the wheels turn. One push and you just keep going." Stanley sat down on the curb and lifted up one foot. He spun the wheels of the skate with his hand. They turned rapidly without making much noise for several minutes until they began to slow down. Stanley looked at Einstein and said, "What do you think of my frictionless roller skates? Maybe I should take out a patent on the idea and sell it to a roller skate company." "Your skates are terrific, Stanley," Einstein answered. He pushed back his glasses, which were slipping off the end of his nose. "But I'm afraid they're not frictionless." "Come on, Einstein," said Stanley. "How can you know that without even trying on the skates? Now, can you solve the puzzle? How did Einstein know that Stanley's skates still had friction? We will find out." Ta-da! "Look at the skates," said Einstein. "They've stopped spinning." "So what?" asked Stanley. "But that's just it," said Einstein. "You started the skates spinning. If they were completely without friction, they would keep spinning forever. But even with a little friction, they will finally slow down and stop." "Perhaps I'd better keep working on the skates," said Stanley. "I think you should invent something else," answered Einstein. "No one's ever been able to make a machine that's completely without friction. It's impossible to have two things touching each other with absolutely no friction." "I guess you're right," said Stanley dejectedly. But then his face brightened. "I say, Einstein," he he said. "I've just mended my automatic measuring machine. Do you want to try it out again?" "When it comes to your inventions," said Einstein, "with friends like you, I don't need enemies." That's the end of chapter 2. So next one is tomorrow night. Chapter 2, The Incredible Sinking Machine. Now, what do we always say when we've finished reading for the night? What do we say? Toilet, teeth, bed. Okay? Now, what do we do about the light? 1, 2, 3. Lights out. Night, darling. Love you. Bye.